Hoş geldiniz, or welcome. I had prepared a speech in Turkish, and more or less went like this. Dear delegates, dudes and girls, welcome to Istanbul. And then, thank God we have succeeded in all of this. Enjoy both the exhibition and the conference. I'll just say a few words, and then I will introduce some housekeeping, and then I will introduce you to our keynote speaker. First of all, there are a few thanks that are very important. This event has been possible thanks to Austin Shaheen, who has worked with me all the way through for the past 2 years, and for the vision of Professor Mehmet Bach, who's the Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. It has been an incredible hard work, and I hope you will appreciate it. On housekeeping side, the boat this afternoon is going to be at 5 p.m. leaving from Kabataş. We will send you a newsletter through the PhD list from ICEA Istanbul, and we look forward to seeing you all there. It's organized by Lectra, and it's, Istanbul will be about showcasing the best of contemporary art. We have a strong relationship with the Biennale, but it will also be about networking and creating new projects, because that's what I believe that makes this sort of events worthwhile. Regarding our keynote, Professor Sean Cubitt, is somebody that I have personally admired for many, many, many years. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was reading his digital aesthetics. He was at Central St. Martin's many years ago, and he left a sign within a very positive one, within the Research Center at Central St. Martin's. It is, for me, a very great honor to present Sean Cubitt. Thank you so much, Joe.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai. He mihi tenei kia koutou katoa. My name is Sean. I'm an honorary Kiwi, and I'm very proud and very grateful to be here on Franco. I'm going to read, which I don't normally do, but I think trying to keep to time may be more valuable than breaking the tradition. So, and I will apologise because I'm going to talk about a very formal aspect of digital media. I know our other keynotes are going to be looking at much broader issues, but I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about just one very small aspect, which is to think about time. The repression of time in dominant media is a characteristic of the digital age. At the same time, the emergence of new forms of digital temporality at the technical level demonstrate grounds for hope that a new relationship with time can emerge. But then again, there are institutional and economic pressures fighting to maintain the atemporal character of our times. The struggle over space and time is the meat and potatoes of digital media, and I want to try to explain what I mean by that. It was for many, many, many years a truism of film and media studies that we lived in an era dominated by the hegemony of illusionistic and narrative media. Avant-garde struggled for abstraction and for non-linear and anti-narrative modes of working. Meanwhile, it was becoming apparent that the development of neoliberal finance capital on one hand and biopolitical management of populations on the other had formed a new political economy whose foundation was a new aggregation of media. I pause here to make a theoretical point. I'm sorry, it's very early in the morning for theory, but there you go. We learn from the Marxist tradition as much as from the very different theses of neoliberal ideology that the economy is the foundation of society. The rival claim most cogently voiced by Foucault is that power, politics, governmentality, is the formative agenda of social life. Both share the belief that there is a foundation. Some forms of feminist and green politics have similar structures: patriarchy, Gaia, relations between genders, or to the natural environment, are key to a good many variants of both. It's important, however, to understand that these terms, market, polity, patriarchy, nature, are abstractions, as indeed is the term society. I really hate agreeing with Margaret Thatcher, but to a certain extent there is no such thing as society, though I think we come from rather different points of view. We need high-level abstractions like these in order to make arguments and discuss values, but we should not mistake them for materiality or materially, physically present facts. It's impossible to see a market. You can't pick up a polity, you can't shake hands with nature. What we must do is enter relationships with human and non-human others, mediated through gesture, or money, or art, or bits, whatever. Mediation is the material form of power, what Foucault refers to as its capillary action, the media through which authority travels from rulers to ruled, or resistance to power acts against rule. Mediation is the material form of exchange made concrete in the exchange of metals, bills, and now of bits, as well as of the material goods and services which we call the economy. A market is a complex collection of mediations between people and raw materials, factories and corporations. Mediations comprise the whole gamut of devices, from clothing to surgical intervention, which make the relation between genders materially significant. And the relations between people and environment are not mental abstractions, but enacted through physical mediation of toxins, pollutants, husbandry, forestry, fishery, and so on. Both power and economy require media to complete their tasks, media without which they cannot function. Mediation names the material processes of interconnection, influence, reverberation, communication, which in specific formations and specific levels of abstraction we call power or economy, and so on. So much for theory. Mediation requires media, and those media have histories which shape the digital forms which now in turn shape our world, and that's what I want to concentrate on. The dominant media of the 21st century are no longer story and picture, but the three pillars of the political economy: spreadsheets, databases, and geographical information systems. It's the task of digital arts in this century to address the peculiar qualities of these dominant media forms, and of eco-critical thinking to demand better of them. But first, we need to analyse how they're constituted. The best way to do that, I believe, is to analyse how they came into being, how their characteristic forms of action derive from earlier technologies and practices. This also has the additional virtue of giving us some traction on how we might retrofit abandoned practices, and also how to recognise genuinely new ones, to hasten the development of new media formations, new art, but also new political economies and new human relationships, new relations with the organic world. Now it seems that writing probably first began as records of transactions in the time of Sumer, about 8000 BCE. For centuries across the Old and New worlds, various means of keeping tallies proliferated, and from them derived much of our mathematics. Double-entry bookkeeping, providing a schematic record of profit and loss, was first formalised and published by Bartolomeo de Pacioli, pictured here, in 1494, so only a couple of years after Columbus. The ledgers used at the time were narrative in form, in the sense that they began at the beginning and were ordered chronologically. It was only the invention of new mechanical aids, like adding machines and cash registers, that changed that narrative form into something rather different. Much the same is true of the ancestors of databases. Ledgers recording the duties owed and redeemed by peasants to their feudal lords or vassals to their sovereigns, and later daybooks recording the activities of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and in factories, and the emergent poor schools and hospitals of the 18th century were written down in the order of their occurrence. Parish records of births, marriages and deaths were written as they happened, and the writing was part of the ritual life of the community. In this instance, the invention of the filing cabinet allowed a new kind of order, one based on arbitrary systems like the alphabet. These made retrieving information simpler, but they did so by abstracting the acts described from their place in the order of time. Instead, date became a system just as arbitrary as the alphabetic order. Now, the mechanisation of bookkeeping and maintaining files went hand in hand with new media like calendars and diaries made popular by mass printing, which Lisa Gittelman has been writing about recently. The temporal order of exchanges recorded in the old ledgers was now rapidly being transformed into a spatial order. And that order was being matched to a cellular grid extending into the future as well as the past. I'm thinking here of the layout of an empty calendar that projects into the past the empty grid of all the events that can possibly occur, matched to this conceptually infinite succession of days or of cells marking the advance of time, abandoning the old semantic cycle of the monkish hours of the Benedictine rule. Like the conceptually infinite succession of future transactions, notably the command and control of debt, which is, of course, a way of managing the future, controlling the future through debt. And the filing cabinet as an instrument of rule, calendars and diaries help compose the rectilinear and conceptually infinite grid of contemporary spreadsheets and databases. Accountancy and record keeping involve essentially human relationships. The map, however, extended the range of power in the age of the great navigations and the first precursors of globalization and colonization to control over geography. Map-making completed the first great act of modernity, the alienation of land from the people who live in it, which was this transformation was at its most profound and most destructive in the great achievement of feudalism. It's what feudalism managed to do to alienate us from land. The translation of typically lateral observations into typically flat representations. If you look, for example, at Cook's logs of his voyages, you get sideways views of coasts, which are later translated into vertical maps of those same coasts. The mapping also of the curvature of the Earth onto 2D surfaces created magnificent leaps in the geometric arts, an object of great beauty. But it also provided rulers and colonists who were their chief market with a God's eye view of the planet. Many of them bore and still bear the trace of time in the form of trails and markers for historic monuments, markers of risk and bounty, eerie dragons. X marks the spot. Many maps trace historical boundaries and shifting tides of empire. So maps do not exclude time, but they do in general subordinate it to space. In the 18th century, ubiquitous adaptation of the systematic grids of longitude and latitude could predict, like a calendar, the indefinite extension of space into realms unvisited by the old world navigators, terra incognita, as you can see at the bottom of the Mercator map here. This was the first step towards the absolute map. The second belongs to the digital summer of the three great media of modernity: accounting, filing, and mapping. Geographic Information Systems, or GIS for short. GIS compiles the data we have on populations and maps it against environments. When Foucault speaks of power mediating between populations and environments, he might almost have been speaking about these massive software suites, where not only what we know, but extrapolations from the present into the indefinite future, or imaginary future, are organised into communicable calculations. That's the art of simulation in the terms of geographic information systems. GIS analysed the powers of these three media with the calendar to provide the perfect instrument of rule, a simulator of consensus and dissent, of conformity, of risk, whose product is a statistical predictor of changes to be avoided or managed. GIS is a machine for ensuring that the future looks as much like the present as the embrace of human and technology can devise. In a sense, the residue of cartography is only a metaphor for two entirely characteristic operations: the arithmeticization of knowledge and its spatialization. All possible futures lie spread out as so many Feynman diagrams or forking paths, each of them open to the managerial rule of biopolitics. The grid of spreadsheets and database cells, of stacks, of map coordinates, of calendrical dates, is a characteristic diagram, as Deleuze would have it, of digital media today. The array of raster display and of CMOS and CCD cameras, LED, LCD and plasma screens, DLP and LCOS projectors, the matrix principle in storage, the grid of QWERTY and calculator keys, the linear arrays of scanners and printers, all of them in Peter Lunenfeld's nice phrase, snap to grid. At the heart of the grid is the triumph of space over time, or rather the spatialization of time. Time is a mysterious thing. Augustine observed in the 5th century that as long as no one asked him to define it, he knew perfectly well what it was, but if they did, he didn't. Once upon a time, time was on the human side of the population-environment equation. Very gradually, time migrated to the environmental side, something that stands over against us. In the way our tools became factories that dominated and constrained our actions by moving over to the environment side, from the human to the environmental side, becoming second nature. To use a now rather old-fashioned term, our tools were alienated from us. And now time has been alienated too. Now, alienation has an important legal meaning as well as the sociological one. Something is alienable if it can be sold, or given away, or otherwise gotten rid of. Slavery is illegal because a human life is not nominally alienable. To say that time has been alienated, then, can be construed as meaning time, like factories and now like information, can be sold. When we speak of political economy, we mean the inextricable movement of economics and politics. The pseudoscience of economics, when it's abstracted from politics, has resolutely failed every test. At the same time, politics without economics has no traction as an explanatory system. Most of all, neither has any actuality unless it is grounded, as we've seen, in the mediations of material media. The alienation of time, its placing over on the side of the environment, makes it necessary, as Foucault suggests, that political economy should mediate alien time back to the population. The instruments through which it does this are the media technologies whose history I've just been sketching. Spreadsheets, databases, and this. So what exactly happens to time in the media technologies of the neoliberal database economy? Time shares the arithmetic properties outlined above. Time occurs in... Oh, sorry, this should have come up a bit earlier. There's an example of a grid. Not just in software, but mapped right down at the hardware level. So take the basic process of digital imaging. Just fortuitously, this is a CCD chip. Standard 35mm CCD. Now, the lens is open for a fixed duration, during which photons are flooding in from the top of this diagram. Where they strike the pixel array of receptors, the photons cause reactions which release electrons. The electrons en masse are what we call charge. To get charge off the chip, ready for the next image to be taken, and of course for them to be turned into voltage and then digitized, they have to be drained into some sort of storage. The design of the chip ensures that the charge will always flow in channels in a specific direction. So these are the channels you can see between the N plus and N minus. That those charge zones in the chip ensure that the charge produced by the photons will drain down the channels that are coming towards us in this picture. So these are sort of like the columns of the future image, the raster array in the future image. The problem, however, is the rows. And the solution is to have the charge from each row cascade down the column in strict lockstep. And for this, you get first the pixels from row 1 come off and then stored, row 2 stored, row 3 stored, but they have to come off synchronously. This requires a clock function. Incidentally, writers complaining of the death of cinema have missed this difference between analog and digital images, concentrating instead on a somewhat bogus argument, I believe, about realism. The real distinction between the two is that analog images only succeed one another in time, whereas digital images, electronic images in general, change or contain time in the structure of each individual image. The time they contain was, of course, worked out in the succession of cinema frames and in greater detail by the scanning function of interlaced TV and analog video. But the soft blur that you can see in this 1964, I think, image from Doctor Who, this soft, blurry cathode ray tube image gives way to an ontological secret which cinema's photographic basis has hidden. No electronic image is ever complete. Even the startlingly fast refresh rates of progressive scan high-definition screens cannot disguise the fading of each image before the successor scan begins. It's this fading which drives television towards 24/7 broadcasting. There's no point in time in which broadcasting is actually complete and has come to an end, in the sense of an ending. The indefinitely extended future of simulation, the pseudo-virtual science of risk avoidance, allows no such satisfaction. And I mean pseudo-virtual here, in, again, a rather technical sense. That pseudo-virtuality plots the knowable outcomes of known trends. The real virtual is the open becoming of unknown futures, which is where I want to end today later in the presentation. The endlessness of transmission is a quality of the pixel as an automated aggregate atom of perception, the flicker that enchants the eye, the essence of distraction. I don't think the optical illusion is quite going to work here, but those of you who know animal characters, Merriweather cover will know that this has a rather enchanting vibration effect when you see the physical object. The essence of distraction, which has exercised commentators on modernity from Benjamin and Krakauer to Jonathan Crary. Historically, the function of editing was to structure flux by interrupting it, changing space and continuity cutting, but also structuring the experience of flux into discernible scenes that succeed one another. Distracted gazing at flux is like watching waves. Cutting, which separates figure from ground and one scene from another, is a mimesis of the concentrated gaze that selects the telling detail and constructs a story, or at least a temporal direction, from the manifold of perception. That process of informing flux is now undertaken at a far smaller pre-human scale, pre-perceptual scale. Though tiny, the pixels of a camera or a projector chip are actually finite in dimension. The duration of exposure is also tiny but finite. Where pixels are atoms, photons are quanta. And the individual pixel in an individual exposure is an aggregate of all the photons raining in on them, their wavelengths as well as their numbers. The result is an average, reduced to the counting units of hexadecimal color numbering. The ordering of time thus occurs not at the level of the frame now, but of the pixel. In addition, most codecs use a form of prediction to reduce redundancy in the signals they transmit. When a block of 4 pixels, a group of 4 blocks, or a less regular slice is made up of pixels of more or less the same color, the codec reduces them all to one numeric code. If they stay more or less in the same place for the duration between keyframes, the data transmitted instructs the display to maintain that color throughout. So what gives you that blockiness when you've got a poor DVD transfer, for example? Or if you're looking at YouTube videos blown up to full screen. Nothing emerges in those spaces. Nothing evolves or changes in that duration. The ideology of efficiency, now embedded in the very media through which increasingly we learn about the world, reduces change to its minimum. So 4 principles are in play. The statistical averaging of captured light to a single figure, the use of unit counting, the clock function as a way of regulating the pixels in this instance, and the predictive tools that minimize change over time. The digital image rejects space, but time is diminished. Sorry, it respects space. It respects space. I'm going to need a drink of water. But time is by no means redundant in digital systems. For example, in packet switching. It's It's a foundation of the TCP/IP suite and increasingly for other kinds of digital broadcasting. The basic idea is simple. Every message, whether it's an SMS or a multimedia file, is split into smaller packets that find their way through the network to be reassembled at their destinations. The problem is this: messages sent out into the network have a limited lifetime. Otherwise, the millions of fragments of undelivered messages, all those 404 errors and all the undelivered emails, will clog up the system. Likewise, if things persist, if datagrams persist in time, then you can't update them swiftly enough. You know, data that lasts for 24 hours will stay cached for 24 hours. So you have to have a restriction on the duration that these things can persist. Packets are therefore designed to contain not just data, but a complex envelope, which I've diagrammed here, which includes the key data for its transmission, as well as sender and receiver address. Each packet contains information on its position in the whole message, how many packets there are, which one is included in the present item, and finally a kind of clock, listing the number of nodes it can pass through on its way to its destination. As it passes through each node, that number is reduced by 1, until, if it fails to arrive, the number reaches 0 and the packet erases itself. This is what network engineers used to call until IPv6, TTL, the time to live. I don't have to tell a room full of artists about the richness of the metaphorical possibilities of time to live. But in obedience to my theme, I just want to emphasize one in particular. Digital media are intrinsically ephemeral. As we've learned at various media art history conferences over the last few years, and also through the flowering of archive research projects and from important experiments like John Ippolito's Variable Media Network, digital media are far, far more prone to decay and loss than their predecessors. One facet of this ephemerality coincides with the management of time. That's time management, risk management, that we have been discussing. The tendency for digital media technologies to live in an indeterminate and unending present whose visual isomorph is the flux of pixel space. There are then 3 large-scale activities going on in the digitization of time. Firstly, as countable units alienated from the human population and placed over against us as part of our habitat, time becomes a commodity. Secondly, through the controlling mechanisms of simulations and predictive codecs, time becomes a medium of power, specifically of biopolitical power, over the emerging future. And thirdly, what both these economic and political analyses share is an aesthetic of spatialization and the endless present. To reiterate, the aesthetic is not the icing on the cake, it's the kitchen where the cake gets made. Political economy is conducted through these media. The forms of these media shape and are shaped by the political economy they mediate. Therefore, the electronic arts we celebrate at ICEA are by no means marginal, but key material resources from which any new political economy will have to be articulated. I take one last example. One of the interesting genealogies is that of projection, as ancient as the caves, as new as liquid crystal on silicon chips. Common to the mechanical projectors which launched in the 19th century are the combination of parabolic mirrors and condenser lenses used to force the light from a lamp through a tiny aperture onto a vast screen meters across. So think of a 35mm frame, a standard cine projector in a hall like this has got to get all the way up here and illuminate this. So controlling the light has been a really important facet of media technology since the 19th century, control of light. Making light coherent would reach one apogee in the pillars of searchlight at Albert Speer's Zeppelin field at Nuremberg. And though I don't want to make the strong statement that coherent light is fascist, the organisation of light that Speer achieved could be recognised as emblematic of a certain kind of modernity and a certain aspiration towards control. Parallel with the development of cine projection, late 19th century experimenters started working with the phenomenon of total internal reflection, first in water and then in glass. 2 new features came on screen in the 20th century. One was laser, light with carefully construed coherence capable of travelling great distances and carrying information. The other was glass fibre technology. The combination of light, coherence and glass in fibre optics is to me the direct descendant of the assemblage of technologies which gave us cine projection and also the searchlight and lighthouses. There is, however, a final step in this process, the waveforms carrying digital signals through fibre optics. And fibre optics, we must remember, are the backbone of the digital political economy. The whole network is fibre optic at its core. The waveforms that are used there are increasingly universally standardized in the transmission protocols in the form of the square wave, which you can see two magnifications of here. The units of digital media are, as we know, ones and zeros. Equally, we're all aware that charge is not, zero charge is all but unrealizable. You can't get no charge unless you create some strange laboratory condition. Zero is a polite fiction for small. In diagrams of square waves, we see equally that the transition from 1 to 0, mapped in the lower of these two, and vice versa, are not immediate and total, but they graduated. Another feature we leave out of our logic. Like the photons we express as hexadecimal numbers, as whole numbers, digital media deal in approximations. The approximations fit our current commodity-based managerialist forms of political economy. As we all know, transmission does not differentiate between different content types, only between units of packets or pixels, neither in packet switching nor in routers. All that's important to the TCP/IP suite and to the functioning of any digital device is that data be ordered in units, and that the units can be handled as if coherent. Processing, such as compression-decompression algorithms, codecs, and colour management systems, and displays, now almost universally raster displays, only complete the universalization of the unit grid as the core diagram of our age. Even a hypercube that provided Baran with the basic diagram for his anti-hierarchical networking is based on the unit side length of a cube. So there we have a certain map of digital terrain, fairly depressing one, from the dominant applications and displays to the clock function, chip design, packet switching, and the square wave of fibre optics. Our media are dominated by unit counting, statistical averaging, and the form of the grid. For me, unit counting is the form of the commodity. Statistical averaging is the core tool of biopolitics. And the form of the grid is their resultant expression in the material media that mediate our lives and planet. These qualities conspire to reduce time to a function of space. Most of all, they replace the emergent and unforeseeable future with the indefinite calendrical extension of the present. And they do so, I argue, in the interest of a very specific configuration of power and wealth, which we could describe as a database economy. Of course, this analysis of political economy, economic aesthetics of digital media is problematic. It's a critique. And critique does not in general lend itself very easily to building new things. Perhaps more important, there is no sign here of work practices that change technologies in subtle or radical ways. So the techniques as opposed to the technologies, which are one of the key practices that alter the actuality of media. And these can be subtle, they can be radical, they can be things like the work of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and gift economies of Linux and Wikipedia. They can be the resilient, evocative, powerful and beautiful art that has been and is being made in these media. Technique, I mentioned in opening, is an engagement in media that goes way beyond the mastery, which is also, of course, all too often a subordination to the inbuilt norms of the tool set. In Marx's account, technology is a congealed form of the skills of generations of workers, dead labour. We could, learning from indigenous wisdom and especially from Maori knowledge, say that technology is where we in the West keep our ancestors. Indigenous people, when they pick up a tool, address the ancestors responsible for bringing it to the people. We, however, have forgotten the name of anyone but the proprietor of the technology, and in many instances not even that. Reconnecting with the living labour of the past in our contemporary technologies is one of the key actions of the digital arts. Inventing new techniques for using digital technologies is another. Demonstrating their limits, working at and beyond them, and creating new uses and retro-engineering what we are presented with. These are also key digital arts. We've little time to discuss, the governance structures and commercial decision-making which produce the current round of standardisation. A case in point would be the EMV chip, which most of us have in our chip and PIN cards nowadays. That stands for Europay, MasterCard, Visa. The control over very critical bits of our digital infrastructure is not in the hands necessarily of engineers and best possible practice, but of what we can get away with and what serves best the needs of our paymasters. Another example would be the codec wars currently raging over the MPEG-LA consortium's attempt to deny that OGG and any other open source codec actually have a right to exist. Patents in this instance are being used to curb innovation, not to generate it. So the problem is, from the psychology of perception used to test colour responses to the design of cell net coverage, good enough is always the cheapest option. Standardising on the good enough is always the first option. Think of the history of VHS tape. Only when the market is saturated and can consume no more of a particular gadget does it make market logic to launch the next format. As long as we accept as necessary and unavoidable the constraints of digital media as given, there will be no investment in getting hexadecimal computing or quantum or optical or biocomputing out of the lab. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be waiting for the corporations to develop our media for us. My favourite example of the road not taken is, slightly in the wrong order, Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad. It's so long ago that these things, well, it's not so long ago that these things were being pioneered. Alvy Ray Smith at the symposium Daniel Palmer and myself worked on in Melbourne talked about writing the code for HSV colour space overnight because he needed it. We take these things as standard, but they are inventions by actual people. In here we've got Sutherland drawing direct onto a vector screen, not a CRT scanning screen, but a vector screen which draws live onto its surface. So we shouldn't be daunted by the existence of sophisticated binary machines any more than Sutherland or Alvy Ray Smith were daunted by the existence of sophisticated automotive engineering. They didn't say to themselves, well, the car people do stuff really well, let's be car engineers. They actually went out to invent something new. I think we're faced with that sort of moment. I think the vector display is a little germ of hope in all of this. And I'll try, as briefly as I can, how long do I have? Yeah, I'll be swift. To say something about the vector. There are two things about vectors that make them an oddity in digital media. Firstly, vectors do not work on counting numbers, but on infinitesimals. I'll leave this is a particularly lovely one. This is Hogarth's Line of Beauty. This is what Hollinsworth's novel refers to as well. And to me, a particularly lovely example of a vector. A vector can be scaled up and down forever without producing the telltale jaggies of bitmap imaging, because it's not composed of the numerical addresses of pixel cells on the grid. A vector is a line expressing an algorithm, one that can be recalculated on the fly, which has a direction. The line A to B is not the same as the line B to A. So it's not the shortest distance between 2 points, it is a trajectory, a gesture. That's why I love the Hogarth drawing in particular. Vectors therefore include time in a way that the grid does not, the raster grid, for example. Ironically, they can only be displayed on raster screens like this one, or this one. Because in almost every domain, since the abandonment of vector screens in the games industry, raster displays dominate everywhere except in a few fields of science and engineering. But the history of raster displays gives us a possible example of how abandoned technologies can be revivified. So in the 1970s, research into plasma screens had reached a dead end. In 2002, however, its pioneers took home an Emmy and Fujitsu were in full production because a PhD student had gone back and managed to find colour solutions for plasma display and make it into a commercial proposition. But the thing had been left lying fallow for the best part of 15 years before that began to happen. Now, I think that's a good example of why going back to older technologies, residual media, is a really important step for us to take. Now, those of us who grew up in Marxism, or indeed in many other Western and Islamic traditions stretching back to Ibn Khaldun, we know to expect at the high point of the civilization the seeds of its decay and its replacement by another. The job at hand is to investigate which emergent principle or principles stand opposed to the hegemony of the grid and its spatialization of everything. This is the actual state of affairs, where by actual we should understand the result of all previous actions. The action is actual as a production of action. What we're looking for is the virtual of that action, what the actual contains as a series of further possibilities that are not fully expressed in its own actuality. And remember, of course, the present is the only time at which an action can take place. Nothing happens in the past anymore, and nothing has yet happened in the future. So today, now, is the only time in which actions are feasible. This is the virtual, right here. Too technical. Posing as coherent and unified wholes, digital media persuade us not only that the present extends indefinitely, but that no action is possible in the wholly actualized digital domain. As Benjamin might have said, the vector smashes this glass prison open with the force of its algorithms. The planned, regimented extension of the actual into indefinite sameness, dreamed of by Stalinists and corporate risk managers alike, crumbles on its own internal dialectic. This is a satirical strategy of Benjamin Edwards' digital painting. Here's one example. I've put two links to these, which I won't show now, but they'll be on the PDF, which will either be on the ICA site or they'll be on my slideshow. Now, he was roundly attacked recently by Whitney Davis in the pages of October. Edwards works by gathering images and logos from the streets of the USA, and especially Washington, D.C., rendering them into 2D and 3D objects for manipulation and composition, and then in many instances reproducing the results as acrylic and mixed media paintings. There's one for Paul Thomas there. There's something still to do with painting, Paul. For Davis, the satire falls flat. Ah, the wit of the digital, he ironizes, a digital analogy to the digital. Davis recognizes in passing, Edwards' point seems to be that the digitally constructed worlds of office fronts and shopping malls, nothing does exist between the digital units. But sadly, he misses the point. Edwards is entirely impressive in his analysis of the artifice of coherence, and in the shockwave sequence documenting the construction of the 2008 painting Triumph of Democracy, painted in response to the financial crisis, the ghostly incompleteness of a planned landscape could not be clearer. If there is a criticism to make, it is that the work deploys vector graphics only to caricature the depthless spatiality of bitmaps. That leaves unaddressed the affordances of the vector to produce difference, the mathematics of emergence. The vector is not an exclusively digital mode. They're traceable in Hogarth's line of beauty, in Clay's admonition to take a line for a walk, and in one of the most emotionally and intellectually satisfying works to date, Chris Landreth's film Ryan. There's a playful, imaginative, ever-evolving animations of its subject, Ryan Larkin, are entirely explicit in the way that the vector graphics are generated by his sort of filmic and animated biographer Landreth. There's a link to the NFB site to play out there. What appears in all these examples, as in the pioneer animations of Ennio Cole, and in popular culture, and some of the best work, I think, of Pixar, is the room they create for futures of which we can only say that they are not the same as the present. On those rare occasions when it's still possible to act outside of the planned accommodations of biopolitics, which of course already has in place strategies to manage the 1% who insist on walking up the down escalator, we make actual the virtual. The potential stored in the existing state of affairs. That is the aesthetics of the vector, openness to unregulated and indeed risky futures. Where time to live is measured in the dull ticking down of a square wave clock function in packet switching, the vector veers out of the plane of the grid in something like an angle I for the mathematicians in the room. The most modest inquiry into the living conditions of the vast majority of the world's inhabitants will demonstrate that the existing regime has failed and fails hourly to ameliorate poverty, hunger, pestilence, and the destruction of human and non-human environments. The wealth it produces is sham celebrity in cheap tin trays. The power it exercises is pure anxiety, risk-averse to the point of inactivity, or it is purely destructive of forces that do try to change conditions. This is the second great facet of the ephemerality of digital media. They occupy a moment not only of apolitical stasis, apolitical in the sense that politics should be about power, but our masters do not wish anything to change. So apolitical status. But it's also about the inevitable fading away of the old, the inevitable instability, the inevitable moment when we will have no choice but to act. The existing time to live of digital media mediation is actually a Heideggerian being towards death. The vector politics of the new media is about becoming, about living the present as action in order to create the future as new. A search for vector art will get you little more than clip art and tutorials, most of numbing, generic, unambitious commercial ordinariness. Many animators I know also disagree with my assessment of Pixar and find their work in 3D vector animation in general dull. Of the great icons of vector mathematics, we, I see, are next are thoroughly bored with the Mandelbrot set. In fact, it's worse than that. The central tool for controlling the steps between keyframes in MPEG and indeed almost every other codec is vector prediction. Born free, the vector is already in chains. I make a plea here, rather than a prophecy, and mark out a job of work. The vector aesthetic does not belong to the grid. It orients towards unforeseeable futures. It is the descriptor of action, of becoming virtual and making new actions possible, new actualities from which further and further changes can emerge. I suppose I'm trying to describe the mathematics and the engineering principles of hope. This is what the vector is for, creating the time to live. Noreva, tenakoto, tenatoto, tenatato kato. We have some time for questions. Yeah. Idle gossip.
Yes. Does anybody?
Yes. Does anybody want to ask a question? Why? Okay. No.
The problem with the vector was that it didn't generate tonal qualities.
Didn't generate?
Tonal qualities. You couldn't do toned surfaces. What was the procedure that got to this? Because you're suggesting that this is a tonal, that this is a vector generated.
Yeah. I think what Landreth is doing here is using, if I understand correctly, and as you know, my technical knowledge begins to fade out of rather indistinct borders. But I believe what he was using was using vector space to produce trajectories through
and I can't remember what colour space he was using. Probably LAB. So he's using a three-dimensional space, and he's producing a vector by putting two forces pulling on a trajectory through space, and that gives you a gradient. As I understand it, that's how he was working. I don't, for a moment, think that we are anywhere close to this, because the problem, as R.V. Ray Smith pointed out, is that these geometric, as he calls them, geometric images have to be displayed on arithmetic screens. So one of the great challenges is to find the vector-based screen that would do this kind of work. But most vector screens haven't been developed for colour. And there are also things about how do you do vector-based photography. That's to say, how would you do true 3D photography and get that manageable inside a computer? Well, actually, that's where the hardware is designed not to deal in general with vectors, but to produce a bit translation. So it's a very, very ambitious project.
And the hardware has to store a display.
Yeah.
So it has to store some set of instructions that allow it to actually get that data up onto the phosphor.
Yeah.
Presumably, there'd be ways of, I mean, what comes to my mind is that one could actually make localized rasters by generating lots of, I mean, essentially the TV display is a very sophisticated vector display, that's all it is. But it's just that we've gone to the point where we have to fix it in memory because we need to actually get it out here next time and the next time and the next time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an interesting proposition to vectorise the whole process.
For the moment, I'm going to keep it as a metaphor, I think, but I'm hoping one of these days. Cinzia, I think you had any questions? 2 rows behind you.
Yeah, it might pull you in the direction you don't want to go, but you said that aesthetics is not the icing on the cake, but the kitchen where the cake gets made, which is, you're going to be quoted a lot, I think, on that. I'm assuming that by aesthetics you mean the aesthetics of mediation, if I'm understanding right. And I'm assuming that you mean aesthetics as a science of perception, so in its wider sense. And I was wondering if you can talk more about that.
Yeah, I put a couple of notes in here to myself. One was to say, this isn't really, I'm trying, like most of us do, to avoid a technological determination. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. First is that this is not a determinist concept. What I'm trying to do, drawing on the philosophers that some of you will already, I'm sure, recognise from the terminology I was using, the idea that it's not about a causal structure. The causal structure is that kind of step-by-step linear causality employed in simulations, in geographic information systems, for example. So I don't mean determinist. I don't believe I'm being determinist because I'm not talking about futures that can be determined. Quite the contrary, it is about the indeterminate. The second is the term technology, and I've used that here kind of in a, I hope, an understandable way, but what I intend by that is the concatenation of human beings, devices, and the laws of nature, for that matter, which operate together to make an assemblage, a technical activity. So I don't think it's a technological determinism, but I do believe that unless we pay really careful attention to the materiality of the media that we're dealing with, then, and I believe this is actually one of the great strengths of ICEA and the electronic and digital arts in general, where serious attention is being paid. If we don't pay that kind of attention, then we are actually handing over control and over these media. This, I think, is actually happening actively in Rosalind Krauss's concept of the post-medium condition, with which I have the deepest antipathy. I believe that is a complete capitulation, as indeed is most neo-conceptual art, to the conditions of the market and to biopolitical management. On the contrary, what we need is digital, extremely medium-specific criticism. Not to say all digital media are, as I've been doing, which is a first sketch, but to say this particular work, using these particular tools, applications, software, display mechanisms, devices, practices, this very specific assemblage made for this work is utterly important. The tools that we use in a given work are critically important. So on the one hand, there is, I think, a universalizing practice in, let's say, the kind of infrastructure which we share with global finance and global governance. At the same time, there is the extremely specific way in which technique interacts with those technologies, changes them, and opens up their possibilities.
Yeah, I like very much this call of yours to specific elements in the work of art, digital work of art. But don't you think that's the case? Don't you think we are going against was the main line of thought in contemporary art? Contemporary art seems to be against all kinds of specifics. Call it back to the 20s and 30s, to Rosenberg or whatever. That's specific. Now, today it is not specific. Is it there?
Yeah, I very much so. I think well, we're now coming up to the anniversary. I think after 100 years, we could probably stop remaking Marcel Duchamp's Fountain of 1912 as if it was an entirely new and totally magical moment which defines the art practice of a generation. I think we've done it to death. And by and large, what I've seen in recent major art shows, that feeling is beginning to be fairly widespread. Certainly, I missed Venice, although I'm told that the same artwork which really shone at the British Art Show this year shone at Venice, which is Christian Marclay's Clock. But by and large, most people seem to think the rest of the show is pretty ho-hum. It seems to be very interesting that show in London, the only two artworks that really stood out as having any kind of sense of actuality or virtuality were Marclay's work, which is a masterpiece of editing, amongst many other things, and Tillman's extraordinary inkjet print. But the rest of the work, neo-conceptual stuff, frankly, was tired, jejune. So I think, yes, there is another moment, yet another moment at which we need to get over this. I think it's time for a new avant-garde, and I think I'm in its presence in this room.
Someone over here.
Thank you. But to comment on what you just said, the time to live message that is being sent out 250 times or however many times is very much like Marcel Duchamp's message. It's just that being reinterpreted every time or repackaged. I do think that I'd like to know your comment about how you were to determine the time to live for the current messages that we're currently working on in terms of its future run. What is the time to live of the avant-garde you're speaking of now that you hope this room is generating?
Well, I think there are several people here who I'd really rather deflect that question to. There are people who have pioneered this work, and I think, like Roy Ascott who's here, and I think Mike Leggett, who've transformed the landscape, who made it possible to work and think and imagine in such different ways. And I cannot really, when, God bless him, when Nicolas Bouguereau was working on the relational aesthetic and some of his examples, you thought, but look at what Roy was doing 15 or 20 years ago, or what Linux has achieved were achieving at that time. The paucity of ambition, the lack of political engagement, the metaphor that has become a metaphor of a metaphor, all of these things seem to be so weak compared to the practices that we see here or at ours, which really engage with change, really attempt to open up new futures. And that, I think, is where, I suppose, like most of us, I will, if possible, take a wander around the Istanbul Modern and see what's on show at the biennial, and no doubt there'll be pieces that I like. But I think that there is something about the basic rule of digital media arts, which is it has to work. We have, first and foremost, to be artisans, to understand our materials and to make things operate, and only then can you do the rest. And the best work, of course, is not just to use the tools that are available, but to transform them in these kinds of imaginative ways. So that, I guess, is where I'm at. I think the attempt to rise above materiality in the guise of the so-called concept is, it's rather like a subprime mortgage market. A really, really interesting concept, but unfortunately, for lack of any kind of reality, it's just not that satisfying.
I wonder if you think, when you're talking about materiality, that you're kind of reflecting back on the body, on the human body. I have this, first of all, I want to say that I don't think we need any more avant-gardes. I think we should lower the guard. What I want to say is that when you mentioned this wonderful Maori reference, and I've read it before in your work, and I think it's really, really effective, but I wonder how to implement it in a way that we can recognize our ancestors in our instruments, in our technology. And, we have this, in Serre, in Michel Serre, we have this notion of the layers of time that are all synchronous with us, right? That we're embodying previous generations in ourselves, in our language. Is human materiality, and it relates to the future of the humanities in this context.
Two, in fact, three really immense questions. I think the first answer would be, I mentioned a couple of points in there, a bigger thesis that I'm beginning to work on for a future project, trying to develop an eco-criticism that's really worthy of the name, which is about this migration of things from the human side to the environmental side. So what do we mean by environment? One of those things, as I mentioned, was land, which still in indigenous cultures is a human thing, but for most of us, it's an alienable thing. The second was tools, and very clearly in the digital era, it's not in what was knowledge and has become information and is now increasingly kind of machine-readable, automated information, which creates an environment over against us. And I think what is currently occurring, and I fear, is that the human body is on the way to migrating from the human side of the equation to becoming an environment or a habitat in which whatever is left of us operates. So unlike the argument, I think is it Agamben makes, that when the medievals were trying to define the human started at the waist and everything below was the devil's. After Darwin, it's sort of like from the neck down is nature. After Freud, it's just the front of your face because the back there is all that's a weird word and stuff. So I think that's kind of that migration, and I fear that the human body is actually in process. So that the DNA-ization is becoming part of that process. The humanities, I think, have been their own worst enemy. I think they have pursued, for very understandable reasons, and I'm in many respects, although I migrated gradually towards social science, but I began in the humanities. I think what the pursuit of specialization, the use of the semicolon in Paradise Lost, has become the absolute enemy of what the humanities are for. The professional schools are there to look at how to create wealth or shelter or clothing.
or beautiful objects. The sciences are there to provide something like knowledge. The humanities are there to discuss the relative value of those things. That's what the humanities ought to be for, but they have failed, and failed, I think, with honourable exceptions, very dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years, to do exactly that, to provide the place in which values can be discussed, and where we can discuss values that do not appear, and health appears in the sort of governmental calculation, but beauty very rarely does. There's a very bogus attempt to include happiness as a quantifiable measure in British governments at the moment, which is a very, very frightening one. And it's able to happen, however, because the humanities have failed to address that. I think the crisis is largely self-generated, and I think it's really important that we stop doing that and begin to put some colours on our sleeves, preferably red and green.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to Sean Cubitt. Now it's lunchtime. There are several locations just outside the towers where you can go, you can explore, and there are two very big malls, and you have the food blog by Feter. If you had time to read it before coming here, you should have a few clues. Just a reminder, the location today is going to be Kabatash for the boat, and you could be there at 5 o'clock. It's very, very easy, because what you do is you just take the subway, then for the subway you take the funicular that takes you down to Kabatash. So you don't even have to get out of the underground, it's just an underground system. And then from there is the ferry dock, and there will be the boat, and you will see us looking there. Thank you so much, and then thank you.